A warm welcome to one and all. I'm the Reverend Doug Watkins, interim lead minister here. And we want to welcome you, whether you are here in person in the sanctuary or watching from home, to Eliot Unitarian Chapel, a liberal religious congregation of spiritual seekers centered in sharing the journey with compassion, love, and justice as our guide. If you are visiting us for the first time, we are very happy you're here, and we hope that the service speaks to you and that you have been warmly welcomed. You should have received a guest form on the way in, and we invite you to fill that out, both sides if you have kids, and leave it in the collection plate. This will help us stay in touch with you. If you are visiting online, please let us know that you're here by emailing welcome@eliotchapel.org so we can personally welcome you. We are currently in the red level here in St. Louis County. That means that we are asking folks to mask when they are inside here at Eliot Chapel. And also, for now, we are suspending of the serving of food and drink. So this morning, I invite you after the service to a social hour, if you are here. And whether here or at home at 12:30, we also have a coffee hour online. So either way, we look forward to building community. That you can join folks in Adams Hall if you are here, or just find a little nook to chat for a bit. We look forward to the level dropping soon so that we can be back to coffee hour. As we move now into worship and our opening words, we begin by lighting a chalice, which is a tradition that came out of World War II that offers the symbol of us being a beacon of hope and of acceptance. Rebecca Savage wrote these words: "We light our chalice as a beloved people, united in love and thirsting for restorative justice. May it melt away the tethers that uphold whiteness in our midst. May it spark in us a spirit of humility. May it ignite in us a radical love that transforms our energy into purposeful action. This is a chalice of audacious hope. This chalice shines a light on our shared past, signaling our intention to listen deeply, reflect wisely, and move boldly towards our highest ideals." Will you rise in the ways that you do and join me in our opening hymn, 153, "Oh, I Woke Up This Morning."
This morning in my mind.
Unitarian Universalists are covenantal in the way that we are together, meaning that we promise and continue to explore how we will be together, how we'll treat each other, what it is that we do. In honor of that, we, every Sunday, speak the covenant that is printed in your order of service, and I invite you to join me in reading that. As together we say, "As a free congregation, we promise to one another our mutual trust and support. To create beloved community, we promise to be kinder to each other than we have to be. To listen fully to each other with an open heart and mind. To speak responsibly and respectfully. To find ways to improve our church for all members and friends." So for our Time for All Ages, I was thinking about how for the last few years, it just happened that every place that I lived only had windows on one side of the building. So every morning when I would look out the window, I would say, well, if I never got outside of my apartment, well, my neighborhood has a hardware store and a taqueria. And sometimes there are ways that we don't tend to look around very often. But there's also sometimes the truth that we're in an apartment that has many windows, but we never really open the shades so that we can see more fully around us. And so it reminds me how often it is that we have to think carefully about how we look at the world. And there are limitations for all of us in terms of what we're able to know. But it is important to realize that there's always more to the world that we know. And it's especially important when there are folks that help us know more about the world, open new windows for us, or pull up the shades to things that we might not know. And so I turn your attention. You should have a picture of Henry Hampton somewhere on your row, and you will have to share probably. So in 1965, Henry Hampton was working as information director for the Unitarian Universalist Association, our national body. And he, along with many people of faith, including many Unitarian Universalists, responded to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s call to participate in a march for civil rights on Selma, Alabama. Well, he found that experience incredibly significant in his life. It changed his perspective about what he thought was possible. But he looked around and he saw so many powerful people and stories. And when he looked at the news coverage, they really didn't delve into what this was like from the perspective of African Americans. And so he decided to become a filmmaker, and in particular, to film things that help show the stories that sometimes are lost. The stories of the leaders of the civil rights movement and the not-so-famous African-American folk who put their lives on the line for justice. He wanted to open even more windows, and so he included the voices of white folks as well, those who opposed the civil rights movement even, so that we know more about what is true in the world. He started his own film company called Blackside Incorporated, and his idea was to make films and AV productions that were meant for and showed African American people. He realized that he had grown up with very few images of African Americans, and when there were images presented, they were often presented in ways that he found terrifying and demeaning, and not his own experience. And so he spent a lot of time exploring the various stories and bringing them to light for people to know a bigger story. And for me, one of the things that I found most meaningful about bringing Henry Hampton to you is that he is probably most famous for his multi-part documentary called Eyes on the Prize, which has been shown many times on PBS and is a long portrayal and exploration of the civil rights movement from 1954 all the way into the 1980s. And I remember that back when I served as a chaplain at the Oregon State Hospital, all of the chaplains came together every night for weeks to watch that special together. And how powerful it was to know not only were we watching these stories, many of which I knew nothing about, but to know that these were presented by a Unitarian Universalist. It reminded me of what is important in our tradition. So, on Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, we honor the ways that we all are called to explore and tell stories that might be lost. We honor people like Henry Hampton, who made it his life's calling to make sure those stories were out there. And it's true that by keeping those stories alive, they change our lives. They offer a mirror for people to understand themselves and each other better. As we explore finding our center, the way that we know as many stories and open as many windows as possible is essential to us finding a center that is most grounded in the world. So I'm happy to share one story of how Unitarian Universalists do that. And I hope as you participate in religious education today, you learn new stories and know more about your own story as well. Let's join together in singing you out as we sing From You I Receive. This morning, I offer a prayer that was written by one of my colleagues, Kathleen Rollins. It is especially meaningful to me because I first met Kathleen in my very first interim position in Ohio, and she and her husband were in the midst of a very long and successful ministry. And I've been an interim minister long enough that eventually they ended that ministry. Wayne retired, and Kathleen is now an interim minister. And so it just reminds me of the long stories that we learn by being part of a faith tradition. She writes these words in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Sunday. Spirit of justice, God who befriends those who stand upon the constant edge of decision, crucial and alone. We are grateful to be together this morning. We are grateful to remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But not only him, for there were thousands of unnamed women and men who put their bodies and their lives on the line so that we all may be free. And yet, freedom comes at a cost. We know that racism and homophobia, ageism, ableism, sexism, and classism, all these often unacknowledged realities prevent us from fully knowing one another, from creating beloved community, spoken by the prophets and ordinary folk alike. May the work of Dr. King continue to eradicate injustice wherever and whenever we encounter it. May we continue to speak out against injustice, to speak even if we are afraid that our words will not be heard, are welcome. May the spirit of Dr. King continue to flow through our daily living May we have the courage of Dr. King as we continue to stand up for justice, reconciliation, and truth, despite, and perhaps especially because of challenge and controversy. Dr. King went to the mountaintop. He saw the promised land, and he reassured us that we will get there one day. This is no paradisal dream, but a reality in our own time. May we each, in the way that our very heart and core lets us know is true, find our own contribution to that reality. On this day, may it be so. In the name of love and justice. Amen. And blessed be. Remaining seated for just a moment, may we stay with that spirit, that presence, and sing together 389. In January, we are sharing our Sunday collection with the Meacham Park Neighborhood Improvement Association. We have a long partnership with this organization and have worked with them in many ways. Their mission is to help improve the quality of life in historic Meacham Park. The association seeks to build community by forums for sharing information, connecting neighbors, promoting activities, fostering civil involvement in our diverse community. As a predominantly African American community in the Kirkwood area, we have long felt it is important for us to do our best to partner and learn together how to live in this world. May we be generous as we give and receive our offering. as our greeters come forward with our offering, I invite us to dedicate these gifts for their greater good by reading together the dedication printed in the order of service. As together we say, to the work of the church, which is weaving a tapestry of love and action, we dedicate our lives, and these our offerings. Thanks one and all for your generosity. A reading from June 5th, 1966, in a sermon delivered by Martin Luther King Jr. at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, part of a larger sermon entitled Guidelines for a Constructive Church. He writes, when the church is true to its principles, it sets out to preach deliverance to them that are captive. This is the role of the church, to free people. This merely means to free those who are slaves. Now, if you notice, some churches, they never read this part. Some churches aren't concerned about freeing anybody. Some white churches face the fact Sunday after Sunday that their members are slaves to prejudice, slaves to fear. You've got a third of them or a half of them or more that are slaves to their prejudice, and the preacher does nothing to free them from their prejudice so often. And then you have another group sitting up there who would really like to do something about injustice, but they are afraid of social, political, and economic reprisals, and so they end up silent. And the preacher never says anything to lift their souls and free them from that fear. And so we all end up captive. Here ends our reading. Thank you so much for that musical introduction to this time. So, in 1966, which apparently was a very, very, very busy time for Martin Luther King Jr., especially the month of June, he stood before the Unitarian Universalists at their annual Ware Lecture. That is part of the General Assembly of the UUA. And he did that first little sermon at the beginning of June, and this probably was towards the end of June. And remember that in 1966, Unitarian Universalism as a combined body had only existed for 4 years. 1961 is when we combined. So in this sort of very young stage of our life together, we had Martin Luther King Jr. stand before our gathered assembly, and he told us this: there are some things in our social system to which all of us ought to be maladjusted. Hatred and bitterness can never cure the disease of fear. Only love can do that. We must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. On this Martin Luther King weekend, I am very aware that when we talk about finding our center, it is natural for calm and rest to be the first things that come to mind as we seek our center. And this is perfectly good in its sense and wisdom. So much of our world would benefit from more calm. So many lives would benefit from less stress, less anxiety, fewer hours at work, fewer commitments. So many of us are already weighed down by responsibility and worry that it only takes one drop of something unexpected to tip us over. And so we long for rest and strength, and we want the swirl to stop. And yes, helping us find peace and calm and strength is a powerful potential benefit of centering. But it is not the only work of the path. Our faith, our history reminds us that being a centered person also involves the opposite of keeping things calm. In order to move toward a balance of justice, we have to upset the current state of things. Oppressive systems need to be challenged and toppled, and to accomplish that, we need to sacrifice comfort and sometimes calm, including our own. We need to remember that achieving a balance of equality requires us to be purposefully, for a time at least, off balance and out of step with culture. And it was MLK specifically to us that said we need to be people who are maladjusted to the way things are. All of this adds up to remind us that our center is much richer than we might originally give it credit for in our lives. So, as we move through exploring this, it's not as if we are saying it isn't essential for you to use that as a place to gain your strength and your resilience. But we're saying that sometimes it also is take a deep breath and jump, that it is begging of you. So as we try to make sense of finding our center this month, it is fine, as the Soul Matters material reminds us, to pull up the image of the Buddha sitting peacefully under a tree. But we can't let that overshadow the image of a diver balancing way up on her diving board, pausing to regain her composure and courage so she can leap and go all in. In the end, instead of only asking yourself and each other, are you centered these days? What if we expanded the question to, where is your center sending you these days? And where is your center calling you to go? As we think about this period of time, we are aware that in the context of the world we live in, we are in the midst of so many places of volatility. We continue to learn a lot about what is happening in our country in its divisions and what sort of fuels the essence of that division. The powerful ways that racism is indeed still significant in our country and in the world. We also are often called to be honest and candid about our own history as Unitarian Universalists. That while we have refused to give up coming to the table again and again, there are so many heartbreaking stories of us making promises with good intention and then dropping the ball. It's important for us to not use any of that as a place of shame or guilt, but a truthful place that reminds us that all of us have important work, and we each have something in our own unique style and our own core that contributes to healing and justice. Ultimately, that's what it asks of us. Even back in the 1965 events in Selma, when there were something like 500 Unitarian Universalists, nearly 1/5 of all of them clergy, we saw firsthand what was happening and the faithful that lost their lives in the process of seeking justice in that time and place. And for us, for many of us who were part of that experience, it changed and transformed us. And each of us probably has our own version of how we may come to understand a little more deeply what is true. If there's something that I've taken out of what I've experienced over the last many years in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, is that I grew up with a very limited number of windows open about what was happening in the lives of people that I saw every day, many of whom I called close friends. I knew what it was like for us at school, although I bet I didn't know the half of what they experienced. But it's only in the last few years, and as hard as it is, that I've begun to realize that often when they left school, their lives were very different than mine. I know in conversation with some of them at the last reunion I attended that we finally talked a little bit about how when they went back to their home neighborhoods, they lived in constant fear. From the time that they were little children, they were taught to be very cautious around police officers because over and over again, the experience of African Americans in our country fostered a very tenuous relationship with justice and fair treatment. We've come to know that white privilege is a reality and that there is a definite bias in all things. Otherwise, the lives of white people receive an unearned advantage if we don't acknowledge and work in the other direction. I'm reminded that in the midst of that, there is a very real and human component to it. That Black Lives Matter because there must be some reasonable protection for the people who are vested in securing their own safety. Black Lives Matter so long as there is the truth to what the poet Danez Smith wrote. Danez wrote, "The feeling you get when you look at your child, turn your head, and then poof, no more child. That feeling, that's black." As long as that sentiment rings true for far too many of those folks who live in the same world we do, we must speak about the truth that Black Lives Matter, and we must do something about the systems that destroy that truth anytime they are able to. I'm reminded that as Unitarian Universalists, one of the things that we struggle with is the messiness sometimes of that work. We want things to have a sort of logical progression. We are happy to do things if we can see really measurable success and feel like what we do turns the page. But as theologian Paul Rasser, who is from our tradition, reminds us, we liberals are often better at formality and abstraction than getting our hands dirty and our feet moving. We sincerely want things to be right in the world, but we also want them to be tidy. But this work will ask us to do hard things and remind us that history does not strip away personal humanity. Indeed, it helps us understand the power of what happened to people. And even in the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., often what we have done is made him such a legend that we think it must have been easy in light of his passion for him to move forward as the leader of such a significant movement in our history. But it may be the reality of Martin Luther King's humanness that is one of his most powerful legacies. I am reminded that as King entered the apex of the civil rights work, he revealed that one night he received what had become a common occurrence, a call in the middle of the night that was a death threat. On that night, he tried to sleep, but unwelcome thoughts began to prey on his mind in the late hours, and King was overcome with fear. He wrote, "I got out of bed and I began to walk the floor. And I'd heard those things before, but for some reason that night it got to me." Stirred into wakefulness, he thought about what he was actually risking, including the safety potentially of his wife and children. And so in that very vulnerable moment, he turned to his center, his spiritual connections, and he prayed with transparency and honesty, as he said he never had before, to let himself be called to an act of love, and to act very specifically in that time and place. And so very soon after that night, he stood before folks towards the end of his life in Memphis, Tennessee, and he said, "We have got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't really matter with me now because I have been to the mountaintop. I've been to the promised land, and I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." So often we think that famous people find extraordinary courage, and I'm sure they do. But that courage never alleviates the great fear and sadness of what it feels like to be called to do what you must do. They were just as human and real and pulled in many directions and wanted to continue to have a life as we do. So, as we think about finding our center in this time and place, it asks us to do some soul searching about what lies within us, but also to just be honest about what we know about the world around us, and maybe open a few new windows to know more. We think about what MLK's vision, the moral arc of the universe being long but bending towards justice, means for us, especially in light of the fact that Dr. King was quoting Unitarian minister Theodore Parker when he said those words. It is very much a part of who we are to do this work. And the wisdom of history has taught us that systemic change and lasting transformation for racism will not take hold as long as we have not examined our own inner beliefs about race. if we are not clear with ourselves about what we really believe and fear in each other, and do the tough work of confronting our own fragility and latent and sometimes not so latent racism within ourselves. Until then, we won't really act with true integrity. So great people throughout history have not been fearless, but they have found the place where they are called from deep within and in the holiness that is around them to do what they must. We each have our own realm in the world where we do our best work. We each will have and do have our unique and powerful version of the truth that we must speak and act from. So perhaps the real question is not what would Jesus, Buddha, Clara Barton, or MLK do? We are not called to be them. And it would make for an impossibly long bracelet to wear around our wrist. But I think that the real question for our lives is, inspired by these great women and men, their passion, their compassion, and called to spread and live the truth, what are you called to do? What am I called to do to bring greater justice and peace? And on this weekend, to find some way to make that real. I pray when my time comes yet again to act and speak for truth, that I may live with an intention that brings justice, compassion, and the transformative power of love. And on this weekend, I offer that same hope and prayer for you. From your center, you will find the power you need. So may it be. Amen. And blessed be. Why don't we rise in the ways that we do and invite each other forward into this work with 1018. Come and go with me. Somewhere in here. There we go. As we get ready to move forward from this time and place, we extinguish this chalice, but not the light of ancient and powerful wisdom or new wisdom that comes in our midst. Not the power of our call to justice and compassion, not the great warmth of human love that is what steeps us in what we are called to do. These remain in our lives, in your life, until we gather here again. I invite you to have a seat and receive one more gift before we move into our day. Thanks for joining us for this service this morning. May the rest of your weekend be meaningful and filled with love. Thanks for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next week. And may we enjoy the rest of our day. And may you be blessed. Thanks for being here. See you soon.